Germany's history is one of transformation. A land that began as a collection of scattered tribes on the edge of the Roman world evolved into one of the most influential nations on earth. Its past is not a straight line of conquest or empire, but a long struggle between unity and division, faith and reform, war and reconstruction. From the ancient forests where Germanic tribes first confronted Roman legions through the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, the Protestant Reformation, and the turbulent centuries that followed, every era reshaped what it meant to be German. The rise of modern nationalism, unification under Bismarck, the devastation of 2 world wars, and the rebirth of a democratic republic, each chapter tells not only Germany's story, but the history of Europe itself. Across more than 2 millennia, this land has produced emperors, reformers, thinkers, and revolutionaries. It has built and rebuilt itself through some of humanity's greatest triumphs and darkest hours. To understand Germany is to understand the making of the modern world. In this documentary, we trace that journey from 120 BC, when Roman chroniclers first recorded the tribes east of the Rhine, through the collapse of Rome and the birth of medieval Europe. This is the entire history of Germany, told from the beginning. The lands that would later form Germany were not a single political or cultural unit. They were a mosaic of tribal societies scattered between the Rhine, the Elbe, and the Oder rivers. Classical writers first recorded their existence when Roman observers, especially Julius Caesar and later Tacitus, encountered these communities and labeled them collectively as Germani. The term was a Roman construct used to distinguish them from the Celts to the west and the Slavs further east. By the 2nd century BC, Germanic tribes such as the Cimbri and the Teutons began moving southward, threatening Roman territory. Their incursions into Gaul and northern Italy between 113 BC and 101 BC culminated in major Roman defeats until the general Gaius Marius reorganized the Roman army and stopped them. These migrations marked the first significant appearance of Germanic peoples in written history. Over the next century, Germanic tribes developed distinct identities. The Suebi, led by Ariovistus, expanded into Gaul by the mid-1st century BC. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul between 58 and 50 BC brought him into direct conflict with these tribes. In 58 BC, he defeated Ariovistus near the Upper Rhine, halting the Suebi advance and establishing Roman dominance along that frontier. Yet the Germanic world remained beyond Rome's stable control. It was a shifting zone of contact, commerce, and occasional war. After Caesar's death, Rome sought to extend its frontier east of the Rhine. Under Augustus, Roman armies under Drusus and Tiberius advanced into Germania between 12 BC and 9 AD. They established forts and administrative centers as far as the Elbe River. However, in 9 AD, the Roman effort collapsed with the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. There, Arminius, a Cheruscan chieftain trained in Roman service, united several tribes and ambushed 3 Roman legions under Publius Quinctilius Varus. The annihilation of roughly 20,000 soldiers shattered Roman ambitions beyond the Rhine. After Teutoburg, Rome consolidated a defensive frontier, the Limes Germanicus, stretching from the North Sea to the Danube. Over the following centuries, the Rhine and Danube rivers formed the cultural and military boundary between the Latin world and the Germanic world. Trade and diplomacy persisted. Roman goods reached deep into tribal territory, influencing local elites who traded furs, amber, and slaves for wine, glassware, and weapons. By the 2nd century AD, Roman observers described major tribal confederations: the Alemanni in the southwest, the Franks near the lower Rhine, the Saxons in the north, and the Goths further east. These were not fixed ethnic groups, but shifting alliances responding to Roman pressure and internal competition. The Marcomannic Wars under Marcus Aurelius, 166 to 180 AD, reflected the increasing instability along the frontier. Plague and climate stress fueled migrations, and Roman attempts to stabilize the region met mixed results. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire entered a crisis. Germanic incursions intensified. The Franks and Alemanni raided deep into Gaul and northern Italy, yet rather than conquest, these movements were mostly raids and resettlements driven by internal pressures. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, the Roman state had adapted, granting federati status to some Germanic groups, allowing them to settle within the imperial borders in exchange for military service. The 4th century brought a new force, the Goths. Originally from the Vistula region, they had migrated south and divided into the Visigoths and Ostrogoths. The arrival of the Huns in 375 AD pushed the Goths westward, triggering the migration period that transformed Europe. In 376 AD, the Visigoths crossed the Danube, seeking refuge within the Roman Empire. Mismanagement and exploitation by Roman officials led to revolt, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where Emperor Valens was killed and the Eastern Roman army crushed. The western provinces soon followed a similar trajectory. The early 5th century saw waves of migrations through Roman territory. Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the Rhine in 406 AD. Roman administration collapsed across much of Gaul and Spain. Meanwhile, the Franks and Alemanni expanded their foothold along the Rhine frontier. By 410 AD, Alaric's Visigoths had sacked Rome itself, a symbolic end to centuries of Roman supremacy in what is now Germany. Roman influence retreated to the west bank of the Rhine. Cities like Cologne, Trier, and Mainz remained Romanized enclaves even as Germanic powers rose around them. The Franks gradually consolidated in northern Gaul and along the Rhine, while the Alemanni dominated the upper Rhine and Danube valleys. The collapse of Roman authority opened the path for these tribal societies to form stable kingdoms. By 476 AD, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor, marked the formal end of Roman rule in the West. The new rulers of former Roman territories were overwhelmingly Germanic: the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Franks in Gaul. The territory corresponding to modern Germany remained fragmented among tribes: Franks, Saxons, Thuringians, Bavarians, and Alemanni. Yet these would soon form the foundation of the early medieval German world. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the territories that would one day form Germany stood at the edge of two worlds. Roman institutions dissolved, but their traces lingered in the fortified cities, the roads, and the Christian dioceses scattered along the Rhine and Danube. Power passed to Germanic tribes that had once served as Rome's allies or enemies, now carving new kingdoms out of the empire's ruins. Among these emerging powers, the Franks proved the most cohesive. Their lands stretched across what is now Belgium, Western Germany, and northern France. Under Clovis I, who ruled from roughly 481 to 511 AD, the Franks began transforming from a loose confederation into a centralized monarchy. Clovis defeated rival tribes, the Alemanni, the Thuringians, and the Visigoths, and established his capital at Soissons. His military skill was matched by a political move that shaped Europe for centuries: his conversion to Christianity, traditionally dated around 496 AD after a victory over the Alemanni. Unlike most other Germanic rulers who followed Arian Christianity, Clovis accepted Nicene Catholicism, aligning his realm with the Roman Church. The clergy and Latin-speaking elites of former Roman Gaul now saw the Franks not as conquerors, but as restorers of order. His baptism by Saint Remigius symbolized a fusion of Roman and Germanic worlds, granting the Merovingian dynasty divine sanction and a literate bureaucracy capable of administering an expanding kingdom. During the 6th and 7th centuries, the Merovingian kings extended Frankish control across much of Western and Central Europe. Within modern German lands, regions such as Austrasia, Alemannia and Bavaria became integral parts of the realm. Cities like Cologne, Trier and Mainz retained their Roman foundations and grew as episcopal centres. Monasteries multiplied, spreading literacy and Christianity deeper into the countryside. Yet Merovingian authority weakened as succession disputes and noble rivalries increased. By the late 7th century, real power lay in the hands of royal stewards known as the mayors of the palace. From this position emerged a new ruling house, the Carolingians. The first of real consequence was Charles Martel, who ruled as de facto monarch between 715 and 741. He reorganized the Frankish army, rewarding soldiers with church lands to secure loyalty. His most famous victory came in 732 AD at the Battle of Tours, where he halted a Muslim raiding force advancing from Iberia. The battle's long-term significance has often been overstated, but contemporaries saw it as proof that the Franks defended Christendom when other powers faltered. Charles Martel's son, Pepin III, the Short, formally displaced the last Merovingian puppet king in 751 AD, founding the Carolingian dynasty. His coronation by papal authority marked a decisive alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Roman Church, a bond that would later underpin imperial ideology in the German world. When Pepin died in 768, his sons Charlemagne and Carloman divided the kingdom. After Carloman's early death, Charlemagne ruled alone. Charlemagne's reign from 768 to 814 transformed Europe's political and cultural map. He conducted near-constant campaigns, waging wars on all sides, against Lombards in Italy, Avars on the Danube, and most relentlessly, the Saxons of northern Germany. The Saxon Wars, fought intermittently between 772 and 804, were a brutal effort to subdue and Christianize a fiercely independent people. The Saxons worshipped at sacred groves and rejected foreign rule. Charlemagne's armies responded with forced baptisms, deportations, and the destruction of their sanctuaries, such as the revered Irminsul. The most infamous episode, the Massacre of Verdun in 782 AD, saw approximately 4,500 captives executed for defying conversion. After 3 decades of devastation, Saxony was annexed and reorganized into bishoprics and counties. This conquest integrated northern Germany into the Christian and Carolingian world, permanently altering its religious and cultural landscape. At his capital of Aachen in today's Western Germany, Charlemagne built a new administrative and spiritual center. The Palatine Chapel, inspired by Roman and Byzantine models, embodied his vision of continuity with the classical past. From Aachen radiated his government's authority. He appointed local counts to administer justice, collect taxes, and raise troops. To prevent corruption, he sent pairs of royal inspectors, missi dominici, across the empire to enforce royal decrees. Charlemagne also sponsored the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning led by scholars such as Alcuin of York. Scriptoria in monasteries copied and corrected ancient Latin texts, ensuring their survival. The reform of handwriting into the clear Carolingian minuscule script improved literacy and record-keeping. Though few outside the clergy could read, the intellectual revival gave Western Europe a unified cultural foundation. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica. The act revived the imperial title in the West, linking the Frankish king to the memory of Caesar and Constantine. It also asserted papal power to confer legitimacy on emperors, a tension that would define medieval German politics. While the Byzantine Empire never accepted the coronation, Western Christendom viewed Charlemagne as the protector of faith and order. By the time of his death in 814 AD, the empire stretched from the North Sea to central Italy and from the Atlantic to the Elbe. Yet the vast realm depended on personal loyalty, not a bureaucracy strong enough to outlast its ruler. Charlemagne's only surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the crown but lacked his father's authority. His attempts to maintain unity through pious reform and orderly succession collapsed into civil wars among his sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. After 2 decades of conflict, the brothers reached the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD. This treaty divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 spheres. West Francia, ruled by Charles the Bald, evolved into the Kingdom of France. Middle Francia, held by Lothair, stretched from the North Sea through the Low Countries, Burgundy, and northern Italy, a fragile corridor that soon fragmented. The third portion, East Francia, went to Louis the German, encompassing Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, and Thuringia, regions that later formed the heartland of Germany. Within East Francia, political power remained decentralized. Local dukes and bishops governed their territories semi-independently. The church retained vast lands, serving both as a moral authority and an administrative network. Latin remained the language of the clergy, while everyday speech developed into regional dialects, early forms of Old High German, Old Saxon, and Old Bavarian. Economically, the 9th century saw a modest recovery. Agricultural estates attached to monasteries and noble courts expanded production. River trade linked the Rhine, Main, and Danube basins, reviving commerce between northern and southern Europe. Yet Viking raids on the North Sea coast and Magyar incursions in the east reminded rulers of the empire's vulnerability. Culturally, East Francia began forming its own identity, distinct from both Rome and France. The people considered themselves heirs of the Christian Roman Empire, but with a northern character rooted in warrior traditions, local loyalties, and Christian kingship. The idea of a divinely ordained ruler responsible for both the temporal and spiritual welfare of his people endured. This ideology later provided the foundation for the medieval concept of the Holy Roman Emperor. By 843 AD, the outlines of Germany's future were visible, though far from unified. A patchwork of duchies, Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, Franconia, recognized a common monarch but retained strong autonomy. The imperial ideal survived as a memory of Charlemagne's glory and a vision for rulers to come. Christianity had reached nearly all corners of the realm. Latin culture coexisted with local vernaculars, and the tension between unity and regionalism had become a defining feature of the German lands. After the Treaty of Verdun, the Carolingian Empire fractured permanently, and the eastern realm, East Francia, began its gradual transformation into the German kingdom. Though its kings inherited the Carolingian title, their authority was tenuous. The empire's strength had depended on the personal rule of Charlemagne. Now power rested in the hands of regional dukes who governed Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, and Franconia almost independently. The 9th century opened with fragmentation and foreign threats. Viking fleets raided the northern coast and river valleys, plundering Hamburg, Bremen, and Cologne. In the east, Magyar horsemen swept across the plains, devastating Bavaria and Thuringia. Slavic tribes pressed against the Elbe. Amid this chaos, the idea of kingship survived more as a unifying symbol than an effective government. Louis the German, ruler of East Francia from 843 to 876, maintained the Carolingian tradition but governed through compromise with the dukes and bishops. His successors, Carloman and Charles the Fat, struggled to preserve unity as invasions and noble rivalries multiplied. By 911 AD, the Carolingian line in Germany had died out with Louis the Child, leaving the nobles to elect their own king, a precedent that would shape German politics for centuries. In 911, the dukes chose Conrad I of Franconia, the first non-Carolingian ruler of East Francia. His reign, though brief and troubled, marked the beginning of an elective monarchy. He spent his rule battling powerful dukes who resisted royal interference. Before he died in 918, Conrad, realizing his weakness, urged his supporters to recognize Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, as king. Henry's election in 919 AD founded the Ottonian dynasty, the first stable German royal house. A pragmatic and disciplined ruler, Henry spent his early reign consolidating power. He subdued the dukes of Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia through diplomacy and limited warfare, binding them through marriage alliances. He also fortified border towns, Bergen, to defend against Magyar raids. His policy of defensive settlement and trained militias produced the first coordinated German response to external threats. In 933, Henry defeated the Magyars at Riyadh, securing his realm's frontiers. He refused imperial coronation from the Pope, insisting his authority came from the German nobility, not Rome, a telling contrast with Charlemagne. When he died in 936, he had restored stability and laid the foundation for expansion. His son, Otto I, crowned king in 936 at Aachen, extended and consolidated this power through calculated marriages and military victories. Otto united the duchies and brought the church under royal influence. His decisive moment came in 955 at the Battle of Lechfeld near Augsburg, where his army annihilated the Magyar invaders, ending a generation of devastation. The victory elevated Otto's prestige across Europe. In 962, Otto travelled to Italy to assist the papacy, which was threatened by local Roman factions. In gratitude, Pope John XII crowned him Emperor of the Romans, reviving the Western imperial title once held by Charlemagne. This coronation marked the formal beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, with Otto I as its founder. The Ottonian emperors ruled not as absolute monarchs, but as overlords of semi-independent duchies. Their power relied on alliances with the church, which they integrated into royal administration. Bishops and abbots received lands and privileges in exchange for loyalty. Because clerics could not pass offices to heirs, they provided a counterweight to hereditary nobles. This system, often called the Ottonian church system, anchored imperial control for more than a century. Under Otto II and Otto III, the empire maintained its reach from the North Sea to southern Italy. Otto III, educated in both Latin and Greek traditions, dreamed of renewing the ancient Roman Empire under Christian leadership. He ruled from Rome, blending Germanic, Roman, and Byzantine symbols. His early death in 1002 ended this vision, but the imperial idea persisted as a defining feature of German identity. His cousin and successor, Henry II, the last Ottonian ruler, focused on consolidating internal power rather than expansion. He strengthened the church, founded the bishopric of Bamberg, and was later canonized for his piety. When he died childless in 1024, the crown passed to Conrad II, founder of the Salian dynasty. The Salians expanded the empire's administrative reach. Conrad II asserted royal rights over imperial lands, codified feudal obligations, and brought Burgundy under imperial control. His son, Henry III, 1039 to 1056, dominated European politics. Popes and princes alike recognized him as the leading Christian monarch. Yet after his death, the balance between emperor and church collapsed. Under Henry IV, 1056 to 1106, conflict erupted between secular and spiritual authority in the investiture controversy. For centuries, emperors had appointed bishops and abbots, but reforming popes, beginning with Gregory VII, claimed this power for the church. When Henry refused to yield, Gregory excommunicated him. In 1077, Henry made the famous walk to Canossa, standing barefoot in the snow to seek absolution. Though he regained his crown, the struggle crippled imperial authority and inspired revolts among the German princes. The conflict ended temporarily with the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which divided powers. The church gained control over spiritual appointments, while the emperor retained influence over temporal authority. Yet the damage lingered. The empire's structure, elective kingship, autonomous duchies, and independent bishops made centralization impossible. Despite political division, the 12th century saw remarkable growth. Population increased, towns expanded, and trade routes connected the Rhine, Danube, and Baltic. New monastic orders such as the Cistercians spread agricultural innovation. German settlers moved eastward into Slavic lands, founding towns in what is now Poland and the Czech Republic, a process known as the Ostsiedlung. Under Frederick I Barbarossa, 1152 to 1190, the empire regained vitality. A member of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, Frederick sought to restore imperial authority and the glory of Rome. He reasserted control over rebellious duchies and led 6 expeditions into Italy to enforce imperial rights. His campaigns met fierce resistance from the papacy and the wealthy northern Italian communes, especially Milan. Despite his military strength, Frederick was forced to compromise in the Peace of Constance 1183, which recognized the autonomy of Italian cities in exchange for their nominal loyalty. Frederick balanced his imperial ambitions with symbolic gestures of unity. He promoted the concept of imperium et sacerdotium, the harmonious cooperation of emperor and church under divine order. Yet in practice, his authority in Germany relied on negotiation with princes and bishops who guarded their privileges. He died in 1190 during the Third Crusade, drowning in the Salif River in Asia Minor. His death left the empire leaderless and disoriented. His son, Henry VI, briefly extended Hohenstaufen power over Sicily through marriage, but he died young in 1197. Henry's widow, Constance of Sicily, secured the throne for their son Frederick II, who became one of medieval Europe's most brilliant and controversial rulers. Crowned king of the Germans in 1212 and emperor in 1220, Frederick ruled both Germany and Sicily, but spent most of his reign in Italy. A patron of science and law, he issued the Constitutions of Melfi, one of the earliest codified legal systems in Europe. However, his focus on southern affairs alienated the German princes, who governed independently in his absence. The papacy, fearing imperial encirclement, excommunicated Frederick twice, branding him the Antichrist. Yet contemporaries admired his intellect. He spoke multiple languages, corresponded with scholars in Arabic, and founded the University of Naples. His reign marked the final high point of the medieval empire's power. When Frederick died in 1250, the empire entered what historians later call the Great Interregnum, a period of political vacuum and anarchy. Rival claimants contested the throne, while local princes entrenched their autonomy. Though the imperial title endured, Germany had become a federation of powerful regional states, an enduring structure that defined its medieval and early modern history. By 1250, the Holy Roman Empire stood as both a marvel and a paradox, vast in territory, yet fragile in unity, Christian in identity, yet divided in practice. It preserved the Roman imperial ideal, but translated it into a uniquely German form, an empire without a fixed capital, held together by oaths, symbols, and faith more than central power. By the early 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire remained vast but fractured, a collection of hundreds of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities loosely tied to imperial authority. Beneath the surface, resentment grew towards the Catholic Church's excesses. Indulgences, simony, and clerical corruption eroded public trust. The spark came from Wittenberg in 1517, when Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk, and theology professor, nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church. His act, though intended as an academic challenge, ignited a movement that reshaped not only German lands but Europe itself. Luther's arguments that salvation came through faith alone and that Scripture, not papal decree, held ultimate authority, spread rapidly through pamphlets and translations of the Bible into vernacular German. The printing press, perfected in Mainz decades earlier by Johannes Gutenberg, became the Reformation's weapon. Within a few years, cities like Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and Zurich adopted Protestant reforms, while others remained loyal to Rome. Germany split along confessional lines, not only religiously, but politically and socially. The Diet of Worms in 1521 marked a turning point. Summoned before Emperor Charles V, Luther refused to recant, declaring, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Branded an outlaw by the Edict of Worms, he found refuge under Frederick the Wise of Saxony. From Wartburg Castle, he translated the New Testament into German, making Scripture accessible to ordinary people and standardizing much of the modern language. The ensuing decades saw waves of religious unrest. The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, inspired in part by Reformation rhetoric about freedom, turned into a mass uprising. Peasants across Swabia, Thuringia, and Franconia revolted against feudal oppression. Luther, fearing anarchy, condemned the rebellion, siding with the princes. Tens of thousands of peasants were slaughtered, a grim reminder that spiritual revolution did not necessarily translate into social equality. By the mid-16th century, Protestant and Catholic rulers sought a fragile coexistence. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 introduced the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. Each prince determined the faith of his territory. It brought temporary calm, but entrenched division. Calvinism, unrecognized by the settlement, would soon upset the balance again. The 17th century opened with Germany still a patchwork of rival states and faiths. Tension erupted into one of Europe's most catastrophic conflicts, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. What began as a local Bohemian revolt against the Catholic Habsburg Emperor escalated into a continent-wide struggle involving Spain, France, Sweden, and Denmark. The war ravaged the German lands. Armies pillaged towns, burned villages, and starved populations. The conflict began in 1618 when Protestant nobles in Prague defenestrated two imperial envoys, the infamous Defenestration of Prague. The Habsburg response was swift and brutal, crushing the rebellion at White Mountain in 1620. Yet foreign powers intervened. Sweden, under Gustavus Adolphus, entered the war in 1630, transforming it into a broader battle for European dominance. The Swedish king, hailed as a Protestant hero, died in 1632 at Lutzen, but his campaigns devastated much of central Germany. The war blurred the lines between religion and politics. France, though Catholic, supported Protestant states to weaken the Habsburgs. By the 1640s, famine and disease had killed up to a third of the German population. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the war and redefined European politics. It recognized the sovereignty of more than 300 German states, effectively confirming the empire's decentralization. The settlement also granted recognition to Calvinism, establishing a fragile but lasting religious balance. Germany emerged from the war in ruins, its towns depopulated, its fields barren, its unity shattered. From this devastation, new powers rose. Among them, the small but disciplined state of Brandenburg-Prussia began to stand out. Ruled by the Hohenzollerns, Brandenburg combined strategic territory with pragmatic leadership. Elector Frederick William, known as the Great Elector, reigned 1640 to 1688, reformed the army, centralized administration, and attracted skilled refugees such as the French Huguenots expelled from France in 1685. His reign laid the foundations for Prussian strength. While the Holy Roman Empire lingered in name, real power shifted toward rising regional states. Austria under the Habsburgs became dominant in the south and east, while Prussia expanded in the north. The empire's emperors, mostly Habsburgs, ruled from Vienna but exercised limited authority beyond their hereditary lands. The 18th century dawned with Europe entering the age of absolutism. Monarchs centralized power, built standing armies, and reformed bureaucracies. In Prussia, Frederick William I reigned 1713 to 1740, known as the Soldier King, transformed his modest realm into a militarized state. His obsession with discipline and efficiency produced one of Europe's most formidable armies. Yet he also imposed frugality and strict order, earning both respect and resentment. By 1740, when his son Frederick II, later called Frederick the Great, ascended the throne, Prussia was ready to challenge Austria for leadership among German states. Within months, Frederick invaded the rich Habsburg province of Silesia, claiming it as Prussia's rightful inheritance. The act sparked the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, a conflict that elevated Prussia from a minor northern state to a major European power. Austria's new ruler, Maria Theresa, resisted fiercely, but Frederick's tactics and his soldiers' precision turned Prussia into a military model for the continent. The war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, confirming Prussia's control over Silesia. The victory stunned Europe. Prussia had challenged the centuries-old dominance of Austria within German affairs and won. But Frederick's ambition did not rest. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, pushed Europe into another devastating conflict. Prussia faced a grand coalition, Austria, France, Russia, and Saxony, all seeking its destruction. Against overwhelming odds, Frederick's disciplined army held firm. Victories at Rossbach and Leuthen displayed tactical brilliance, yet the war exhausted his resources and people. Only the death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth in 1762 and her successor Peter III's admiration for Frederick saved Prussia from collapse. The peace that followed left Silesia firmly in Prussian hands and confirmed Frederick's reputation as one of Europe's great strategists. More than a warrior, Frederick was also a reformer. Influenced by Enlightenment ideas, he modernized administration, promoted religious tolerance, and improved education. He corresponded with Voltaire, saw himself as a philosopher king, and declared that a ruler was the first servant of the state. Under his reign, Prussia became efficient, literate, and confident, the foundation of what would later become the German Empire's core. The rest of the Holy Roman Empire, however, remained fragmented and stagnant. Hundreds of principalities, ecclesiastical lands, and free cities continued to coexist uneasily. Imperial authority under the Habsburgs was largely ceremonial. Enlightenment thought and the industrial stirrings that began in Britain reached German lands slowly, yet beneath the surface a shift was coming, one that would soon dismantle centuries of imperial structure. The French Revolution in 1789 sent shockwaves across Europe. Monarchs watched in horror as the old order crumbled in France. Initially, German rulers reacted with repression, fearing revolution might spread across the Rhine. But as revolutionary France turned outward under Napoleon Bonaparte, German lands were drawn into the storm. By 1803, Napoleon's campaigns had reached the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The Reichsdeputation's Hauptschluss, a vast reorganization, secularized most church territories and dissolved many small states. Over 300 political entities were reduced to fewer than 40. In 1806, Napoleon crushed combined Prussian and Austrian forces at Austerlitz and Jena Auerstedt. The Holy Roman Empire, already hollow, finally ceased to exist when Emperor Francis II renounced the title. A millennium of imperial history ended in humiliation. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a French-dominated alliance of German states meant to secure his control over Central Europe. Prussia, reduced and humiliated, was forced into submission after 1806. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 stripped it of territory and pride. Yet this defeat also became the seed of transformation. Prussia's reformers, led by Baron von Stein, Karl August von Hardenberg, and military leaders like Gerhard von Scharnhorst, recognized that survival required change. They modernized the army, abolished serfdom, restructured education, and promoted merit over privilege. The University of Berlin was founded in 1810 as a center of intellectual revival. The concept of the Volk, the people as a cultural and national community, began to take shape. German nationalism, long dormant, found voice in humiliation. Meanwhile, Napoleon redrew Europe's map but could not extinguish resistance. In 1812, his invasion of Russia turned disastrous. Sensing opportunity, Prussia switched sides in 1813, joining Russia, Austria, and Britain in the War of Liberation. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of Nations, was decisive. Napoleon's forces were defeated and his empire began to crumble. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna met to restore order to a war-torn Europe. Led by Austria's Prince Metternich, the delegates sought stability, not revolution. Germany was reorganized into the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states under Austrian leadership. Prussia gained significant territory, including the Rhineland and Westphalia, giving it economic and industrial advantages for the future. Although the Holy Roman Empire was gone, the idea of Germany as a shared cultural and historical space endured. The poet Johann Gottfried Herder had spoken of the German nation as united by language and spirit, not politics. Thinkers like Fichte and Arndt transformed that cultural pride into a political dream, the unification of all Germans under one state. Yet after Vienna, reactionary conservatism dominated. Metternich's system of censorship, surveillance and repression, the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819, sought to crush liberal and nationalist movements, but the intellectual current could not be fully contained. Across universities and towns, secret student societies, the Burschenschaften, kept the flame alive. After the Congress of Vienna, the German Confederation of 39 states replaced the Holy Roman Empire. It was a compromise. Austria held the chair, Prussia gained land and influence, and the rest clung to local sovereignty. But the settlement preserved fragmentation. To Metternich and the conservative order, unity meant revolution. To many young Germans, it meant destiny. The post-Napoleonic decades brought deep tension between repression and reform. Across universities, liberal intellectuals gathered around the idea of Volksgeist, the spirit of the people. The Burschenschaften student fraternities, inspired by patriotic ideals, called for constitutional government and national unity. In 1817, at the Wartburg Festival, thousands celebrated Luther and German heroes, symbolically burning reactionary works. The government responded with the Carlsbad Decrees in 1819, banning nationalist groups, tightening censorship, and placing universities under surveillance. The dream of freedom went underground, but never disappeared. Meanwhile, Prussia began quietly building the foundation of modern Germany, not through politics, but economics. In 1818, it established a customs union within its own lands. By 1834, the Zollverein, a larger German customs union, unified most states except Austria into a single economic market. Tariffs were removed, railways expanded, and industries flourished. The Zollverein achieved economically what diplomacy could not: integration. It also subtly positioned Prussia as the leader of German progress. Industrialization accelerated in the 1830s and 1840s. Coal mines in the Ruhr, steel works in the Saar, and textile mills in Saxony turned provincial towns into industrial centers. Railways knit regions together and spread ideas faster than any army. Alongside material growth came social upheaval, urban poverty, labor unrest, and the first stirrings of socialism. The new industrial class demanded representation, while the working class demanded rights. Cultural life mirrored the turbulence. Poets and thinkers like Heine, Boehme, and the young Hegelians challenged the status quo. Romanticism, once idealistic, grew political. Music by Weber and early Wagner evoked mythic German identity, while philosophers such as Hegel argued that history moved through conflict toward freedom. The spirit of change was everywhere, and it erupted in 1848. That year, revolutions swept Europe. In the German states, liberal uprisings demanded constitutional rule, freedom of the press, and above all, unification. Barricades rose in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Vienna. The Frankfurt Parliament convened to draft a liberal constitution for a united Germany. Delegates debated monarchy versus republic, Austria versus Prussia, but unity slipped through their fingers. When they offered the imperial crown to King Frederick William IV of Prussia, he refused, declaring he would not accept a crown from the gutter. Without military support, the revolution collapsed. Reaction triumphed. Still, the failures of 1848 did not erase the idea of unity. They clarified who would lead it. The middle classes had proved too idealistic. Power would pass to those who could impose order. That man was Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck, a Prussian Junker born in 1815, entered politics as a staunch conservative but possessed unmatched pragmatism. Appointed minister-president in 1862 by King Wilhelm I, he promised to strengthen Prussia through blood and iron. His goal was clear: unify Germany under Prussian dominance, not liberal principles. He began by reforming the army and defying the liberal parliament's opposition. Then came a trilogy of calculated wars. The first, the Danish War of 1864, allied Prussia with Austria to seize Schleswig and Holstein, testing Prussian military modernization. The second, the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, settled the leadership question. In 7 weeks, Prussia's needle guns and railway logistics crushed Austria at Königgrätz. The victory expelled Austria from German affairs. The resulting Peace of Prague dissolved the old Confederation and replaced it with the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Bismarck gave it a constitution with a federal structure and an elected parliament, the Reichstag. It was a limited democracy under autocratic control, but it bound northern Germany together politically for the first time. The southern Catholic states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, remained outside but were economically tied. Bismarck knew sentiment would bring them in only through a common threat. That threat came from France. Emperor Napoleon III feared Prussia's rise and sought to curb it. In 1870, diplomatic tensions over the Spanish succession spiraled into war after Bismarck manipulated the Ems dispatch, making France appear the aggressor. The Franco-Prussian War united Germans in outrage. Southern states joined the northern cause. Prussian discipline and industrial might proved decisive. Victories at Sedan and Metz shattered the French armies. Napoleon III was captured and Paris fell after a long siege. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, King Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor, Kaiser. The German Empire was born, not from liberal revolution, but from military triumph and realpolitik. Bismarck's vision had prevailed, a conservative, Prussian-led nation forged through war and diplomacy. The empire unified 25 states under a federal constitution, with Prussia dominating both land and influence. Berlin became the capital. Bismarck served as chancellor, balancing monarchy, military, and parliament with ruthless skill. Industrial expansion surged. Railways, steel, and chemical industries transformed Germany into a modern power. National pride soared, though so did authoritarianism and militarism. The unification of 1871 fulfilled centuries of longing, but left contradictions unresolved. Germany was united yet divided in spirit, liberal ideals suppressed beneath imperial authority, Catholics and Protestants wary of each other, socialists rising amid inequality. Bismarck had created a state, not yet a nation of equals. After 1871, Bismarck's early task was consolidation. The Kulturkampf, culture struggle, launched in the 1870s, sought to limit the Catholic Church's influence in politics and education. Laws expelled the Jesuits, placed schools under state control, and required civil marriage. Catholics, a third of the empire, rallied in resistance through the Centre Party, forcing Bismarck eventually to retreat. Economically, the empire entered an age of transformation. The 1870s brought a temporary depression, but the long-term trend was explosive industrial growth. Coal from the Ruhr and Saar, iron from Lorraine, and new steelworks in the Rhineland-powered expansion. Bismarck, ever pragmatic, turned to social policy as a tool of control. Fearing socialism more than poverty, he outlawed the Social Democratic Party in 1878, yet simultaneously pioneered social insurance, health, accident, and old age benefits to bind workers to the state. His welfare legislation, the first of its kind in Europe, aimed less at compassion than at stability. By the 1890s, the Social Democrats still gained votes, but the empire had proved adaptable enough to survive early mass politics. Foreign policy remained the Chancellor's true stage. Bismarck understood Germany's position, powerful but encircled by weary neighbors. His aim was the isolation of France and peace with Russia and Austria. The Dreikaiserbund, League of Three Emperors of 1873, sought cooperation among conservative monarchies. When tensions rose in the Balkans, he mediated through the Congress of Berlin in 1878, preserving balance while asserting German diplomacy. His reinsurance treaty of 1887 with Russia kept both peace and ambiguity, ensuring France remained without a major ally. Colonial ventures arrived late and half-heartedly. In 1884 to 1885, Germany acquired territories in Africa and the Pacific, Cameroon, Togo, German Southwest Africa, and New Guinea. Driven more by prestige and business lobbies than state strategy, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, chaired by Bismarck, regulated the scramble for Africa. Colonies remained marginal to German power, but important symbols of imperial pride. Bismarck's balance could not last indefinitely. When Kaiser Wilhelm I died in 1888, his son Frederick III reigned for only 99 days before succumbing to cancer. The new emperor, Wilhelm II, only 29, dismissed Bismarck in 1890. Impetuous and ambitious, Wilhelm believed Germany's destiny was global prominence, a Weltpolitik of naval expansion and colonial rivalry. Where Bismarck had preferred caution, Wilhelm pursued spectacle. Under the new regime, industrial might fused with nationalism. Admiral Tirpitz's naval program sought to challenge Britain's Royal Navy. The construction of battleships and cruisers fueled pride at home and anxiety abroad. Diplomatic isolation deepened. The reinsurance treaty with Russia lapsed, prompting Russia to ally with France in 1894. Britain, wary of German naval growth, later joined them in the Entente Cordiale and the Triple Entente. By the early 20th century, Europe's alliances had hardened into opposing blocs: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy versus France, Russia, and Britain. Domestically, the empire flourished but grew restless. Urbanization exploded. Berlin's population surpassed 2 million by 1910. Education spread, science advanced, and universities produced figures like Planck, Koch, and Einstein. Yet politics lagged. The Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage but had limited power. Real authority lay with the Kaiser and his ministers. Conservatives dominated rural Prussia, while Social Democrats became the largest parliamentary party by 1912, an irony in an empire built to contain them. Crises in the Balkans and Morocco tested the fragile peace. German support for Austria's hardline after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, set the chain in motion. When Austria declared war on Serbia, alliances activated, Russia mobilized, Germany declared war on Russia and then France, and Britain entered after Germany violated Belgian neutrality. The Great War began in August 1914. Germany's Schlieffen Plan sought a quick victory in the west before turning east. Initial advances reached the Marne but stalled. Trench warfare followed. The Western Front became a static wasteland of barbed wire and artillery. On the Eastern Front, German armies under Hindenburg and Ludendorff achieved victories at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, crushing Russian forces. By 1916, Germany stood at the height of its military reach and the edge of exhaustion. Total war transformed society. The economy shifted to armaments. Food shortages bred resentment, and civilian morale eroded under blockade. The 1916 to 1917 turnip winter symbolized deprivation. Political power moved from the Kaiser to the generals while socialist opposition grew. In April 1917, a small group of exiled Bolsheviks, aided by German strategy, returned to Russia. The October Revolution soon took Russia out of the war through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Germany gained vast eastern territories, a fleeting triumph that masked collapse at home. In the West, the final gamble came with the spring offensive of 1918. Initial breakthroughs failed to deliver victory. Allied counterattacks, reinforced by American troops, pushed the exhausted German army back. By autumn, the front crumbled. Sailors mutinied at Kiel, and revolution spread through cities. On November 9, 1918, Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, Germany signed the armistice. The war left the empire shattered. Over 2 million German soldiers were dead. The economy lay in ruins. The monarchy was gone, replaced by a provisional republican government in Berlin. Bismarck's empire, the product of discipline, hierarchy, and ambition, had imploded under its own contradictions. The dream of power had turned to catastrophe. Yet within that collapse, another transformation began, the attempt to build democracy on the ruins of Imperial Germany. The German Empire collapsed in November 1918, not with conquest, but with exhaustion and revolution. In Kiel, sailors refused to sail on a final suicide mission. Their mutiny spread to cities across Germany. Workers' and soldiers' councils, inspired by Russian Soviets but more pragmatic, took control of factories and garrisons. The monarchy, brittle and isolated, crumbled. On November 9th, Chancellor Prince Max of Baden announced Kaiser Wilhelm II's abdication before the emperor himself had agreed. That same day, the Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed a republic from the Reichstag balcony. The new state, named after the city where its constitution was drafted, Weimar, emerged from chaos. It inherited defeat, hunger, and humiliation. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed the armistice in a railway carriage at Compiègne. Many Germans, especially veterans, saw it as betrayal, the stab-in-the-back myth that later poisoned public life. But the truth was simpler. The army had lost the war. In June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles formalized Germany's punishment. It stripped Germany of Alsace-Lorraine colonies and territory in the east, limited its army to 100,000 men, and demanded reparations so vast they seemed impossible. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, placed sole responsibility for the war on Germany. For many, this clause became a national humiliation. The Weimar leaders, bound by necessity, signed it. Nationalists branded them November criminals. The Republic began under siege. In 1919, communist uprisings erupted in Berlin, Munich, and the Ruhr. Right-wing paramilitaries, the Freikorps, crushed them with brutal efficiency. The following year, those same units turned against the government in a Kapp putsch, a failed coup that exposed the army's ambiguous loyalty. Violence became a language of politics. Between 1919 and 1923, assassinations of ministers, judges, and politicians multiplied. Economically, the early years brought collapse. To pay reparations, Germany printed money, eroding confidence in the mark. In 1923, hyperinflation spiraled beyond comprehension. Bread cost billions of marks. Life savings vanished overnight. Pensioners and workers carried wages home in baskets of worthless notes. The middle class, once stable and proud, was ruined, a wound that never healed. In the same year, crisis reached breaking point. French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr after Germany defaulted on payments. The government called for passive resistance, halting production, and worsening inflation. When the chaos peaked, a new figure, Gustav Stresemann, stabilized the mark through a new currency, the Rentenmark, and ended passive resistance. He negotiated the Dawes Plan in 1924, which restructured reparations and brought American loans. The Weimar Republic briefly regained its footing. Culturally, the mid-1920s became an age of extraordinary vitality, the Golden Twenties. Berlin buzzed with modernism, cinema, jazz, and cabaret. Bauhaus architecture redefined design, while thinkers like Thomas Mann and Brecht captured the moral tension of a disoriented age. Women gained the vote, new freedoms flourished, and the arts experimented with provocation and satire. Yet beneath the vibrancy, fragility remained. Politically, the Republic's structure was both advanced and unstable. It established universal suffrage, proportional representation, and a strong presidency. But proportional voting fragmented the Reichstag into many parties, making coalition rule precarious. The Social Democrats, Centre Party, and Liberals alternated with conservative blocs. Each crisis tested the Constitution's resilience. In 1925, the old Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, a symbol of imperial nostalgia, was elected president. Though committed to legality, he represented the conservative forces that never reconciled to Weimar democracy. Abroad, Stresemann's diplomacy eased tensions. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 normalized borders, and Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926. For a moment, stability seemed possible. Then came 1929. The Wall Street crash triggered a global depression, and Germany, dependent on American credit, was hit hardest. Loans were recalled, factories closed, and unemployment soared past 6 million. Hunger returned to cities. The fragile middle class, already scarred by inflation, turned from despair to anger. Extremes on both left and right surged, communists promising revolution, nationalists promising revenge. Amid this collapse, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, found their moment. Led by Adolf Hitler, a failed Austrian artist and veteran of the Great War, the party had been a fringe movement in the 1920s. After the failed Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, Hitler served 9 months in prison, using the time to write Mein Kampf, a manifesto of racial hatred and expansionist ambition. His lesson from failure was clear: power must be taken legally before it can be wielded absolutely. In the early 1930s, Nazi propaganda turned despair into direction. It blamed democracy for weakness, Jews for economic ruin, and Versailles for humiliation. Hitler's speeches promised national rebirth and Tausendjähriges Reich, Thousand-Year Reich, and a Führer, leader who would restore order. His movement fused nationalism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism into a single intoxicating message. The SA, brown shirts, brought intimidation to the streets. Violence became theatre. By 1930, the Weimar coalition had collapsed. Governments ruled by emergency decree under Article 48 of the Constitution. Democracy hollowed from within. In the elections of July 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, though still short of a majority. Elite conservatives, thinking they could control Hitler, persuaded President Hindenburg to appoint him Chancellor on January 30, 1933. It was the fatal miscalculation of modern history. Within months, democracy was extinguished. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext for emergency powers. Civil liberties were suspended, opponents arrested, and the Enabling Act of March 1933 handed Hitler dictatorial authority. The Weimar Republic, born in idealism, tested by crisis and undone by its own weaknesses, was dead. What followed was no restoration of order, but the descent into tyranny. The institutions of the Republic, built to safeguard freedom, had been used to destroy it. Germany, weary of chaos and desperate for direction, had traded democracy for discipline and would pay for it with catastrophe. The year 1933 marked Germany's final descent into dictatorship. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, backed by conservative elites who thought they could contain him. Within weeks, he dismantled the fragile remains of Weimar democracy. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, blamed on communists, gave Hitler a pretext for sweeping emergency powers. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties, freedom of speech, press, and assembly under the guise of national security. The Enabling Act, passed in March with intimidation and deceit, granted Hitler the right to legislate without parliamentary approval. Germany ceased to be a democracy. It became a one-party state. By midsummer, all opposition parties were outlawed. Trade unions were dissolved, replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. The states lost autonomy. The press was censored, and political opponents, communists, social democrats, liberals, filled new concentration camps such as Dachau. The Gestapo, established in 1933, enforced obedience through terror. Hitler's consolidation of power combined propaganda with brutality. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, crafted a total media system that glorified Hitler as Germany's savior. The Führerprinzip, leadership principle, elevated him as infallible. Radio, film, and education carried the same message: national unity, racial purity, and blind loyalty. The Nazis redefined national identity through exclusion. Jews were stripped of citizenship, civil servants purged, and the regime pursued the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, a racially pure people's community. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws institutionalized anti-Semitism, banning marriage or relations between Jews and Aryans and excluding Jews from public life. The Jewish population, about 500,000 people, became stateless in their own country. The Nazi vision also targeted others deemed unfit: Romani people, disabled individuals, homosexuals, and political dissidents. The regime's eugenics program sterilized or killed thousands. Meanwhile, Hitler rebuilt the army in open defiance of Versailles. Rearmament provided jobs and pride, masking the dictatorship's brutality with the illusion of recovery. By 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, violating the treaty's demilitarization clause. France and Britain protested but did nothing, a silence Hitler interpreted as weakness. That same year, Germany joined Italy and Japan in forming the Axis, united by hostility to democracy and communism. In Spain's civil war, German forces tested their weapons and tactics. The bombing of Guernica by the Luftwaffe's Condor Legion foreshadowed the terror to come. Domestically, Hitler's grip tightened. The economy reorganized under the four-year plan of 1936, aimed at autarky and preparation for war. Unemployment fell sharply, though through forced labor, rearmament, and exclusion of women and Jews from the workforce. The Nazi regime offered order and national pride in exchange for submission and silence. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria, the Anschluss, welcomed by cheering crowds in Vienna. Later that year, the Munich Agreement handed Hitler the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, under the banner of self-determination. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home proclaiming, "Peace for our time." Within months, Hitler proved otherwise. In March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, the first time Hitler seized non-German territory. Europe realized appeasement had failed. When Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. The Second World War had begun. The early years brought rapid success. In 1940, German forces overran Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in a matter of weeks. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined tanks, aircraft, and mobility in devastating coordination. By June, German troops paraded through Paris. Britain stood alone, enduring the Blitz, nightly bombings that sought to break morale. In June 1941, Hitler turned east, launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers. The war in the East became a campaign of annihilation driven by ideology. Nazi policies sought to destroy communism, seize land, and exterminate inferior peoples. Behind the front lines, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, massacred Jews, communists, and civilians. Entire villages were erased. By 1942, Germany controlled most of continental Europe, but the war had become global and the tide began to turn. The United States entered after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, aligning with Britain and the Soviet Union against the Axis. Meanwhile, the final solution, the planned extermination of European Jews, reached its full horror. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, senior Nazis formalized genocide as state policy. Industrialized murder followed. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other camps turned death into routine. Trains carried millions to their deaths, Jews, Roma, Poles, and Soviet POWs among them. By 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. It was the darkest chapter in human history. On the battlefield, German fortunes collapsed. The defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 shattered the illusion of invincibility. 300,000 German soldiers were lost. In 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, opening a Western front while Soviet forces advanced from the east. Germany was trapped between two inexorable armies. Inside Germany, resistance was limited but courageous. The White Rose students in Munich spread anti-Nazi pamphlets before being executed. In July 1944, officers led by Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler. The plot failed. Thousands were executed in reprisal. By early 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg burned under Allied bombing. millions of civilians fled the advancing Red Army, facing hunger and violence. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops encircling Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years of glory, had lasted 12. The cost was unimaginable. Europe was devastated. Germany itself was occupied, divided into zones controlled by the Allies. The capital, Berlin, was split. At Nuremberg in 1945–46, the surviving leaders of the Nazi regime faced trial for crimes against humanity, establishing a precedent for international justice. The war left a legacy of guilt, destruction, and reckoning. Out of the ashes, two new Germanys would soon emerge, one democratic and aligned with the West, the other communist under Soviet control. But in 1945, all that remained was ruin, silence, and the unbearable weight of history. When the war ended in May 1945, Germany lay shattered, physically, politically, and morally. Its cities were piles of rubble, its population displaced and starving. Over 7 million Germans had died. Millions more were refugees from lost eastern territories, and every surviving family bore scars of the conflict. The country that had once dominated Europe ceased to exist as a sovereign state. The Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was also split into 4 sectors. The Potsdam Conference in July to August 1945 formalized these arrangements while setting goals for denazification, demilitarization, and democratization. Nazi institutions were dissolved. Leaders were tried at Nuremberg. The trials established a global precedent. Individuals could be held responsible for crimes against humanity. In the immediate post-war years, survival eclipsed politics. The economy was in ruins, transport networks destroyed, and hunger rampant. Millions of displaced people, returning prisoners, forced laborers, and expellees from the East flooded the western zones. Cities such as Hamburg, Munich, and Cologne were half destroyed. In the Soviet zone, entire factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. But beneath the surface of reconstruction, the Cold War was hardening. Between 1945 and 1949, political tension between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union turned Germany into the central fault line of the emerging bipolar world. The Western zones merged economically under Anglo-American supervision, while the Soviets built a socialist administration in their zone. By 1947, Western policymakers realized that recovery was impossible without reviving Germany's economy. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, poured billions of dollars into Western Europe, including the western zones of Germany. The Soviets refused participation and instead tightened control over their territory. That same year, the Berlin blockade tested this fragile balance. In June 1948, the Soviets cut off road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Western Allies out of the city. In response, the Allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying over 2 million people entirely by air for nearly a year. When the blockade ended in May 1949, it was a clear Western victory and the symbolic start of divided Germany. On May 23, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, or West Germany, was officially founded. Its constitution, the Basic Law, established a parliamentary democracy with Bonn as its provisional capital. The new state joined the Western Bloc under US protection. Its first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, prioritized integration with the West, NATO membership, cooperation with France, and entry into the European Economic Community. In response, the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, on October 7, 1949. Its capital was East Berlin, and its ruling party, the Socialist Unity Party, SED, dominated all aspects of life under Soviet guidance. The GDR followed the model of a centralized planned economy, nationalizing industry and collectivizing agriculture. Two Germanys now faced each other across an ideological frontier. West Germany became a capitalist democracy aligned with the United States. East Germany became a socialist dictatorship aligned with Moscow. Both claimed to represent the true German state. Through the 1950s, West Germany rebuilt with remarkable speed. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, transformed it from ruin to prosperity, fueled by the Marshall Plan, a skilled labor force, and industrial efficiency. Refugees from the East provided manpower, while democratic institutions gained legitimacy. Adenauer anchored West Germany firmly in the West, but also sought reconciliation with Israel and its neighbors, recognizing the crimes of the Nazi era. In contrast, East Germany remained under strict state control. The GDR rebuilt heavy industry, but shortages and repression defined daily life. The Stasi, one of the most extensive secret police networks in history, monitored citizens relentlessly. Thousands fled to the west through Berlin, the last open escape route, until the East German government sealed it off. On August 13, 1961, construction began on the Berlin Wall. Concrete, barbed wire, and watchtowers cut through neighborhoods and families. Officially called the Anti-Fascist Protective Barrier, it was in truth a prison wall designed to stop emigration. Over the next 3 decades, more than 100 people were killed trying to cross it. The wall became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, freedom and repression divided by concrete. Despite the barrier, both states developed distinct identities. West Germany democratized deeply, hosted American troops, and helped shape the new European order. East Germany claimed social equality and industrial strength, but its citizens lived under censorship and fear. The ideological competition extended to culture, sport, and education, each side portraying itself as the legitimate successor of German civilization. In 1969, Willy Brandt, West Germany's new chancellor, introduced Ostpolitik, a policy of outreach to the East. He sought reconciliation, recognizing the post-war borders and easing tensions with Poland and the Soviet bloc. Brandt's kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in 1970 became a powerful gesture of remorse and humanity. East-West relations improved modestly, and both German states joined the United Nations in 1973. Meanwhile, East Germany, under Erich Honecker, presented itself as a model socialist state. It achieved some economic stability and prided itself on social welfare and women's equality. Yet beneath the facade, dissatisfaction grew. Travel restrictions, shortages, and propaganda bred quiet resentment. By the 1980s, both Germanys were prosperous compared to much of Europe, but the divide felt unnatural. Families split, cultures mirrored. The cracks widened as Soviet power waned. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, openness and reform, across the Soviet sphere. These changes inspired protest movements throughout Eastern Europe. In East Germany, citizens demanded freedom to travel and political reform. In September 1989, thousands fled through Hungary and Czechoslovakia when those countries opened their borders. Mass demonstrations erupted in Leipzig and other cities chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," "We are the people." The regime wavered. On November 9, 1989, an East German official mistakenly announced that border crossings were opened immediately. Crowds surged to the Berlin Wall. Guards unprepared let them pass. That night, Berliners from both sides climbed the wall, cheering, crying, and chipping away at the concrete that had divided them for 28 years. The fall of the Berlin Wall was spontaneous, euphoric, and irreversible. In a few months, communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed. East Germany disintegrated politically and economically, unable to sustain itself without Soviet backing. Reunification followed swiftly. On October 3, 1990, the German Democratic Republic formally acceded to the Federal Republic of Germany. Berlin became the united capital once again. The event marked the end of the Cold War and the rebirth of a single German state, democratic, sovereign, and integrated with Europe. Yet unity carried challenges. The East's economy collapsed almost overnight. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and social dislocation persisted for years. But the symbolism outweighed the hardship. Germany had regained what war and ideology had stolen, its wholeness. On October 3, 1990, Germany officially reunited after 45 years of division. The moment was both triumph and test. The Cold War's end had restored sovereignty, but unity demanded rebuilding an entire nation, economically, politically, and psychologically. The collapse of East Germany left a vacuum, industries obsolete, institutions dismantled, and millions uncertain about their future. The newly enlarged Federal Republic inherited not only territory, but also the responsibility of integrating two societies that had lived under different systems for decades. Helmut Kohl, West Germany's Chancellor since 1982, became the first leader of a reunified Germany. He promised blossoming landscapes in the East, advocating rapid economic convergence through a one-to-one currency exchange between the West German Deutsche Mark and the East German Mark in July 1990. The intention was symbolic parity between citizens, but it triggered deep economic strain. State-owned enterprises in the East collapsed under market competition. The Treuhandanstalt, the agency responsible for privatization, sold or closed thousands of factories. Millions lost jobs. Throughout the 1990s, Germany poured vast resources into reconstruction, over €2 trillion across 3 decades. New highways, housing, and infrastructure reshaped the East. Yet unemployment and resentment persisted. The wall in the head, as sociologists called it, lingered. Many East Germans felt like second-class citizens in their own country. Still, the broader transformation succeeded. By the late 1990s, democratic institutions had taken firm root across all states, and Berlin resumed its role as the nation's capital in 1999, symbolically uniting past and present. In foreign policy, reunified Germany faced the challenge of redefining its place in Europe and the world. For decades, West Germany had anchored itself in NATO and the European community. The new Germany reaffirmed these commitments, determined to prove it had learned from its history. It played a leading role in shaping the European Union, EU, supporting monetary union and the creation of the euro, introduced in 1999. Germany became the EU's economic engine and one of its chief advocates for integration and stability. The 1990s also brought a reckoning with the past. Memorials to Holocaust victims were built, archives opened, and education reinforced remembrance as a civic duty. In 1998, Gerhard Schröder, leader of the Social Democratic Party, SPD, became Chancellor, ending 16 years of conservative rule. His government continued economic reform, introduced a welfare restructuring agenda, Agenda 2010, and oversaw Germany's first major military involvement since 1945, participation in NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999. The decision reflected Germany's evolution from post-war pacifism to a cautious, responsible power willing to act in defense of humanitarian principles. At the dawn of the 21st century, Germany entered a new phase, prosperous, democratic, but unsettled. Globalization reshaped its industries while immigration diversified its cities. In 2005, Angela Merkel, the first woman and the first East German to become Chancellor, took office. Her tenure would define modern Germany. Merkel's leadership emphasized pragmatism, stability, and moderation. Under her government, Germany navigated crises that tested both resilience and reputation. The 2008 global financial crisis and the subsequent Eurozone debt crisis positioned Germany as Europe's reluctant stabilizer. Merkel pushed austerity and fiscal discipline, policies that drew both praise and criticism, but ultimately preserved the euro. Domestically, Germany remained the EU's strongest economy, driven by manufacturing, exports, and innovation. Yet inequality grew, and parts of the East continued to lag behind the West. The demographic challenge of an aging population became a central concern. In 2015, Merkel faced one of her greatest tests, the European migrant crisis. As refugees fled wars in Syria, Iraq, and beyond, she made the controversial decision to admit over 1 million asylum seekers, declaring, "Wir schaffen das," we can do this. The policy drew admiration for its humanity, but also sparked backlash, fueling the rise of the far-right alternative for Germany, AfD. Germany's politics polarized, yet its institutions held steady. Merkel's steady crisis management, from the Eurozone to migration to the COVID-19 pandemic, earned her the title of Europe's de facto leader. Meanwhile, Germany's cultural and scientific influence flourished. Berlin became a hub of art, film, and technology, while universities and industries advanced renewable energy and engineering. Germany's Energiewende, a national transition towards sustainable energy, demonstrated its commitment to climate diplomacy and humanitarian aid, underscoring a shift from historical guilt to global responsibility. By the late 2010s, Germany stood as a model of stability in a turbulent world, but challenges accumulated: declining birth rates, dependence on Russian energy, and debates over digital transformation. The COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 to 2022, exposed bureaucratic weaknesses, but also demonstrated effective crisis coordination. Merkel retired in 2021 after 16 years, succeeded by Olaf Scholz, a social democrat who promised continuity with reform. In 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine forced a historic pivot. Scholz declared a Zeitenwende, a turning point, committing to rearmament, energy independence, and a reassertion of Germany's strategic role. The move marked a profound shift for a country long defined by post-war restraint. Germany supplied arms to Ukraine, increased defense spending, and reduced reliance on Russian gas, signaling a new era of assertive pragmatism. Socially, Germany continued to evolve. Immigration, identity, and remembrance remained intertwined in national debate. The Holocaust was no longer a living memory for most Germans, but its moral weight endured as a defining part of political culture. The country faced pressure to balance moral leadership with realpolitik, sustainability with industrial necessity, and unity with diversity. By the 2020s, Germany had become the fourth largest economy in the world, a democratic pillar of Europe and a cautious global power. Its journey from tribal confederations and empire to dictatorship and division, and finally to reconciliation and leadership, made it one of history's most dramatic national transformations. Modern Germany is not free of tension. East-West disparities persist. Populist movements challenge consensus. Questions about Europe's future hang in the air, yet the Republic endures, anchored by constitutional strength and collective memory. The lessons of its history, the fragility of freedom, the danger of extremism, and the value of cooperation remain at its core. As of the present day, Germany stands as a nation both ordinary and extraordinary, a society that rebuilt itself from ashes, not once but twice, and emerged as a model of resilience, democracy, and restraint. Its history, stretching from Roman accounts in 120 BC to the modern European Union, is a story of reinvention, a long confrontation with power, identity, and redemption. Across more than 2 millennia, the story of Germany has been one of paradox, unity forged through division, progress emerging from ruin, an identity shaped by conflict as much as creation. From the forests beyond the Roman frontier to the corridors of the European Parliament, the history of Germany is the history of Europe itself, a constant struggle to reconcile freedom with order, faith with reason, and memory with the future. If you liked this video, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Since you stayed this long, perhaps you would like to check my other videos. Recent video is about the history of Persia. Until next time.